workshop, European Security Architectures and Their Implications, a host of scholars from all over the world really, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, North, South, but also Australia and the US, we were discussing questions pertaining to how to organize European security. I mean, European security has been organized in different ways throughout the last decades. We can think, for example, of NATO, the EU, the OSCE, but there used to be called an organization called the WEU as well, who were all trying to organize European security. And so in this workshop, we want to take stock of these particular developments and ask the question of whether, and if so, how the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is a watershed moment for organizing security, and how the different organizations that exist to this day have reacted to it. So what worked well and what didn't work so well. So there were many different opinions and papers being presented during this workshop, and this was a very fruitful debate that I assume will continue for much longer.
It's a very big event. Some people say it's the biggest game changer in the last 30 years. Others say it's the biggest tragedy that is happening in Europe since the Second World War.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was a watershed moment for the European security architecture.
So the war in Ukraine is the most substantial challenge to the established order in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And it challenges the double hegemony of NATO and the European Union. So with respects to NATO, the war is really targeting sort of the ability of sovereign states to make decisions about their future with regard to military alliances. And so that upsets the potential for a US-led order in Europe.
I think it's fair to say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the EU response to it changed the practice of EU sanctioning for good. First of all, it set a new standard. In the future, any EU response to an international crisis is going to be compared to this sanctions regime that have been taken against Russia. Secondly, we witness a growing politicization of sanctions inside the EU. Sanctions have become a topic of political debate, not only among member states, but also inside member states, as we've seen recently in the election in Slovakia. Finally, we saw a change in the process, with the European Commission playing a bigger role in putting the sanctions together. That's an interesting break of practice that we're going to have to monitor in the future.
I would argue that it's merely a data point in the long-running trends we've seen now of revisionist states acting in ways that are unbound by institutions and rules that were set up in the aftermath of World War II and continue on to these days. So what we might see more of in going further is actually more adversarial relationships and systemic competition. However, where we do see a game changer is in the context of EU's geopolitical identity. European Union these days is much more geopolitically assertive actor, and this doesn't just go to its relationship with the Russian Federation, but rather its relations with revisionist states such as China.
So I believe that the Russian war in Ukraine is a game changer for Europe. In that it has triggered a series of action and reactions in the continent, and most notably in the European Union. So spanning from EU enlargement policy to common foreign security policy and to EU diplomacy, the Union has proved to be fast and cohesive and decisive in its response to serious infringements of international law happening in its neighborhood.
You understand how bad things can be if the things that you worked on, they are not fixed. And basically, you know, on the one hand, you can see it as a bankruptcy of many experts working on European security issues. But I would say the experts on European security issues were not really listened to by policymakers. So there were a lot of suggestions on how to manage to find solutions for issues that existed between NATO and Russia, Russia and the West, how to find the proper security arrangement for Ukraine, and these were ignored in favor of a simple and seemingly easy solution that turned out to be a never-ending horror.
If you think about the security architecture of a continent like Europe with several different nation states, it's clear that if you want to provide security collectively, your sovereignty is at stake. NATO, for quite a few years, has allowed Europe to avoid the cost in terms of sovereignty of providing security by basically allocating to a third institution, NATO, the provision of security in Europe. The provision of security on the European continent cannot rely so heavily on a single partner as it is at the moment. We have been following the dependency of Ukraine on US armaments, for instance. Europe can only do up to a little point so far because we simply do not have the capabilities or the institutions to replace the key role of the United States.
Compared to the past, and particularly to the EU response to the 2014 conflict in Ukraine, the EU response has been mostly formal and collective. In 2014, there was an informal group of member states composed of France and Germany that responded within the normative format to the Russian invasion of Ukraine through the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. Whereas in 2015, there were informal groups of member states, but these groups mostly faded away after a short time, and also they generally did not steer EU foreign and security policy. Nonetheless, it is relevant to note that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the current war also hindered the dream of a strategic autonomy of the European Union beyond NATO.
Before Russia invaded Ukraine, European publics, but also governments, had very reserved views about nuclear weapons, including of the NATO nuclear sharing arrangement. After the war in Ukraine, the situation changed. The governments became more open and appreciative of the nuclear deterrence, including NATO nuclear sharing agreements. Germany, for example, decided to procure new F-35 fighter jets. But we also see in public opinion that European publics became more appreciative of the deterrent function of nuclear weapons and can even imagine their use as a legitimate tool in certain circumstances. We don't know how long this will last. There are certain signs that this trend might reverse. However, we know, at least now, that the anti-nuclear views that were so common in Europe are not actually fixed and can change.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine could be a critical juncture for European security. NATO published last year its strategic concept focusing once again on collective defense, on defense and deterrence as main task after many years of attention devoted to crisis management. We remember the military operation in Afghanistan.
The way the European Union works at the moment, both in defense and on foreign policy, attributes an enormous power to individual member states which can at will veto any decision. So one of the key issues in the reform of the European Union is not just creating new European capabilities, but also creating new ways of achieving decisions by removing national vetoes.
The question remains how sustainable the change will be. The war fatigue is starting to appear and the preferences of the member states are starting again to differ. So we will see in the upcoming future whether this united front will continue to exist.
What we might see even more of in the coming weeks, months and years is this question of what it means for European security and defense. Many are speculating that this war, as it continues, makes Europeans more rather than less dependent on the United States on all matters of security.
Since 1991, NATO has increasingly served, I would argue, as a block on European military integration. And that's really become a problem probably since the early 2000s, whereas NATO is a substitute for European military integration, which is why European allies don't develop the dependency, or they have a dependency on the US and don't develop military capability. They're instead relying on the US because it's easier, right? It's easier than managing the politics of defense integration. It's easier than pooling sovereignty with respect to national security. And so therefore the default is to rely on NATO and the US. And so I think we really need to work out that relationship better going forward, increasing responsibility for the EU in this area as a partner to NATO, right, rather than NATO substituting EU capacity.